Do you want to learn about psychological growth without sorting through the jargon? You're in the right place. This is the Relational Psych Podcast. I'm your host, licensed therapist Tyson Connor. On this show, we learn about the processes and theories behind personal growth and experience a little bit of it ourselves. This is Season 2, where we'll focus on the practice of relational psychotherapy and explore concepts and theories that consider psychology from a relational lens. And please, keep in mind that this podcast does not constitute therapeutic advice, but we might help you find some. And my guest for this episode is Sally Bjorklund. Sally is a psychoanalyst practicing in Seattle. She works with adults and couples and provides clinical consultation for therapists. She was co-founder and faculty of Relational Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy Seattle. She is a clinical supervisor in the National Training Program for the National Institute for Psychotherapies, is on the editorial board of the journal Psychoanalytic Perspectives, and teaches locally in various programs. She was a contributor to Clinical Implications of the Psychoanalyst Life Experience, When the Personal Becomes Professional, and has written and presented on various topics, including sex and gender, adoption, aging, working with hard-to-reach patients, and erotic transference. Sally, thank you for coming on the show.
Hi, Tyson.
And today we are going to be answering the question, or beginning to answer the question, because it might take longer than an hour. What is a psychoanalytic understanding of sex and gender? So, Sally, what's a psychoanalytic understanding of sex and gender?
Well, I guess we have to start with Freud, where psychoanalysis starts, right?
Absolutely.
So, Freud is somewhere in the culture, in the language we use that we don't necessarily know came from Freud. But the Freud actually upset the whole Victorian society with his ideas about sexuality, of talking about how our sexuality is polymorphously perverse, and that his idea that we have this three-part structure of the id, the ego, and the superego was the next part of his theory, that because the sexual instinct is so unruly that we have to use our ego to control it, to make it work in the proper directions, which according to him are that sex should be about reproduction, it should be heterosexual, and his three parts of the, what would he call, the way that we're put together psychologically are the id, the ego, and the superego. So the id is this thing, home of the sexual instinct. Mm-hmm. It's what drives us. Mm-hmm. And this is, when you hear about Freud and drive theory, the drive is the sexual instinct. Okay. And it's the ego's job to control the id drives, to make them work in collaboration with the demands of society. The superego then is also our conscience, our moral advisor that's formed by our parents and social regulations, and it controls us through anxiety, mostly through anxiety, right? And guilt. So Freud compared the ego to the ego's relationship to the id as the rider and the horse. Mm-hmm. So if you think of the horse as the unruly sexual drive, then the ego is the rider who has to keep things in control. So Freud also thought that repressed sexual desires were at the root of all symptoms. So
right. I feel like our listeners might have, depending on their familiarity with Freud, the one thing that they'll most quickly go to in their mind is like, he's the guy who talks about sex all the time. He's the sex guy. Like that's, and even in kind of pop culture or in like conversations on the internet, anytime Freud comes up, one of the first things people point out was like, wow, that guy was constantly thinking about sex all the time. And what I'm hearing you say is that at Freud's time, in Freud's social context, people weren't really talking overtly about sex and sexuality. It was a pretty highly repressed social context that he was in. There were clear rules about these things, and we didn't really talk about it. And Freud's, or that was like maybe the academic culture. and part of what Freud did that was so valuable was he did start talking about it. And he made sense of human behavior through this, and a human mind, with sexuality as like pretty central to it. You described this like 3-part person idea, which every time I hear about it from Freud, I think it was Aristotle also had like a 3-part person idea, but he called it the appetite, the reason, and spirit. And his analogy was of a charioteer, where reason was the charioteer, and then appetite and spirit were these 2 wild horses that wanted to go different directions. And it sounds like Freud had a pretty similar concept of like the ego being the self, and that kind of negotiates in some ways between the id that wants things and the superego that says, well, this is how you behave appropriately to be acceptable. Something like that.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And that's an interesting comparison with Aristotle, I think. But what it got me thinking of is something that Michel Foucault has written about in his book, The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, is that in the late 1800s, the sexologists of the time, even before Freud, were creating sex as a psychological phenomena. That before that, sex was just something people did. So the idea that it then becomes a sin or a psychological drive is a new idea. It's like trying to connect the body with the mind in a new way. So the difference between, so the sexologists are categorizing different types of sexuality. So Foucault would say that, before the sexologists, people who had same-sex sex were just doing something. And after the sexologists, it became an identity category. So it was who you were, not what you did.
Interesting. So that kind of cultural, social shift was happening pretty concurrent, maybe a little bit before Freud. He sort of jumped on that wave at a time where that was happening in conversations where people were curious about sex and also about human identity.
Right, exactly. So the idea of categorizing things of that something becomes who you are and not just what you do, I think was a significant historical change. Also, the Victorian sensibility about the body was, if you were wealthy, if you were upper class Victorian, the focus on not talking about the body as this kind of dirty thing you don't want to think about, versus the average peasant who's very much in their body and living with all the bodily functions and there's no indoor plumbing. People sleep all in the same room, so the children are seeing their parents have intercourse, and this is part of the background which Freud is writing about sex in a kind of new way, where he's saying that this is normal. We're all born polymorphously perverse.
Yeah. So what does that mean? Polymorphously perverse.
Polymorphously perverse means anything can be an object. That our sexuality isn't tied to what he later called the aim, and the proper aim and object, I suppose it would include animals or same-sex or incest, or that anything can be a target, because we're driven by this sexual impulse, the instinct of the id.
So when Freud says we're all polymorphously perverse, and that's like a scandalous thing to say, it's because at the time there was the idea that among the upper crust, the people who were a little more disconnected from their bodies, we'll say, at least in their how they thought about folks and how they thought about being, there was an idea that like sex is a thing that you do that's also becoming an identity category, but it's like it's for procreation and it's between adult men and adult women and it's between adult like men and their wives, right? That's like the category of like that's what sex is. And Freud showed up and said, well, actually, inside of a person's mind, your sexuality isn't just constrained to that specific context. It kind of can go lots of different places and inside of your mind, even if you're not acting on it. Is that kind of what he's getting
Well,
at?
I'm not sure the upper class Victorian society was. I think on the surface they were very prudish and applied to women were very prudish, but
Sure.
I think that sex was just what it always is.
Right.
I don't know. Have you seen Bridgerton or those kind of recreations of...
Throughout history, although cultures are different, people are still people and people tend to have sex.
So I think what I was trying to say about Freud is that he did two kind of opposite things. He said sexuality is normally unruly and perverse, and that what's required as we develop psychologically is that we become proper riders of the horse or steering the chariot. And the other thing he believed was that repressed sexuality was at the root of all psychological symptoms.
So he really was all about sex.
Yes.
Every depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, psychosis, all of it.
Everything had to do with some kind of repressed sexuality.
Whoa.
And then there's two kinds. Then there's the two kinds of unconscious, or the repressed, which is something that you've thought about, and then because it's unacceptable, you deny it or put it out of your mind. And then there's the drive of our id, our beast, that's unconscious to us from the beginning. We were never aware of our id drives.
So in terms of parts of human sexuality that Freud thought caused trouble, there was the stuff that came in that we chased out of our awareness. And then there was the stuff that never was in our awareness in the first place. And each of those could cause trouble in their own separate ways.
Right. If the id drive, if it can't be managed by your ego and your superego, it's going to get you into trouble.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that makes sense.
And the other things, the example that Freud gave from one of his patients was this woman had all these weird symptoms. She had paraphesias and contractures. That's so your like arm would get stuck in some paresthesias. I think I said something else. Your arm would get stuck in some weird position. You couldn't move it. She sometimes spoke in a foreign language for no apparent reason. And what he discovered through analysis was that she had been sexually attracted to her sister's fiancé. And as soon as that came out, her symptoms went away.
Huh.
So that's kind of Freud's basis of saying these weird, unexplained symptoms all have some kind of repressed sexual reason. And so the job then of psychoanalysis is to uncover the repressed desires. Right? That's basic Freudian psychoanalysis.
So the image that I'm hearing that's developing in my mind is that, like, to significantly oversimplify Freud's theory of sexuality, there was like an aim, a purpose of sexuality, which is to create more human beings, sort of a very biological basis, and it's heterosexual, and it's with a person who can reproduce, and that's healthy. That's what we're aiming for. That's what we're trying to become. And if that's where our sexuality is aimed, then we are psychologically well. But at the same time, that human beings' experience of their sexuality is incredibly varied, and that everyone has sexual drives and experiences and attractions outside of that aim. And so then was his understanding that, like, the goal of, like, wellness, essentially, was to like no longer feel those other like attractions or to be aware of them or
Well, let me just back up because he talked about the instinct, and the aim and the object. So
right.
those are the things that have to line up.
Gotcha.
So you have your instinct is something you're kind of stuck with dealing with, but
Right.
your ego needs to be in charge of having the proper aim, which is reproduction, and the proper object, which is the opposite sex
Right.
adult partner. I I think the other thing that he really focuses on is symptoms having to do with repressed sexual desires. So that's different than the id drives, or what Stephen Mitchell, one of the founders of relational psychoanalysis, came to call the beast. Which, by the way, Stephen Mitchell rejected Freud's idea of sex as the thing that drives human behavior. Right? So, but just sticking to Freud, it's like that. I think he thought society was in charge of regulating a certain amount of people's behavior, but psychological health or treating people with symptoms meant being able to discover what their repressed sexual desires were.
And would those things be so the category is instinct, aim, and object. Instinct is I want to have sex. Aim is I want to have sex for this purpose. And object is I want to have sex with that person or thing.
Well, that's the holding the reins. It's the instinct. It's the thing you're stuck with. That's the horses.
Okay.
And the aim and the object are the proper harnessing
Gotcha.
of the drive.
I see. And okay. So this is Freud's conceptualization, which is pretty well tied to the time that Freud was around. And attitudes about human sexuality, and we haven't even talked about gender yet. Maybe we won't get there today. Maybe that'll be a separate conversation. But attitudes about human sexuality have changed a fair bit societally since Freud. How has psychoanalysis and its attitude towards you've made mention of Stephen Mitchell, one of these founders of this modern relational contemporary psychoanalytic movement, school, whatever it is. He rejected Freud's idea of the centrality of sexuality. So how did he think about sex?
Well, I should back up a little to
Sure.
say that this is early Freud. So Freud later, partly influenced by what he saw of the horrible stuff that went on in World War One, introduced the idea of the death drive. So Freud's idea is that we are driven by these two drives, which sometimes work against each other. The sex drive, which is like a life instinct, and a death drive. So then along comes, well, there were some things in between, but Stephen Mitchell, like in the 1980s, and other people that were instrumental. There isn't really a founder of relational psychoanalysis. There were a group of people, but he and Dave Greenberg wrote the book that kind of started the whole relational revolution. And one thing Steve was pretty adamant about was rejecting the sexual instinct as the major motive of human behavior. He referred to that Freud's sex instinct as the beast. And he believed he was influenced by Fairbairn and other psychoanalytic thinkers to feel that a need for connection and attachment was a much more fundamental motivator of human beings. So the whole drive theory, I think, has really been displaced by an idea that our attachment needs. I mean, attachment theory has
Right.
practically everybody knows about that and has
Yeah.
read books, so they know their attachment style. And
Sure. Yep. Yeah. So attachment sort of became more of the central. If there's a motivator, if there's a drive involved, it's probably more. The modern relational thinking would probably turn to attachment sooner than it turned to sex.
Well, absolutely. And if anything, I think later relational thinkers have been a little critical of Mitchell's downplaying of sex as a drive, like taming the beast too much.
Right.
So there is more of a emphasis on the importance of the body and sexuality, along with the need for connection and attachment. Andre Green kind of famously complained that relational thinking had taken sex out of psychoanalysis, right? Which of course is a drastic, given its beginnings, it's a drastic thing to take out.
Right. I'm thinking about how much of this conversation is about about culture, right? We're talking about the culture that Freud grew up in, and we're also talking about the culture of psychoanalysis and how psychoanalysis talks about sex and how we choose to talk about it as a group. Like Freud's talking about sex in a way was very disruptive for the time, and a way for him to speak directly to what he was seeing. And it almost feels like there's a, I don't know, a pendulum swing or a push-pull happening where Mitchell and others are kind of de-emphasizing the sexual side of things in a way to try to expand it and to say well, maybe there's other things going on. Maybe there's other things to think about. And also, maybe I'm thinking about psychoanalysis's place in society in the 80s and 90s. Maybe there's some motivation to try to make it a little bit less weird and more acceptable to broader culture. Saying if everyone thinks of us as the people who talk about sex all the time, I don't know. That's just me playing with ideas. But it's interesting how much of this becomes a dialogue about how are we going to talk about this, and what does that mean for us as a community? How do we talk and think about sex, and is it the thing at the center? And do we have normative expectations of this is how a person's supposed to be? I don't know.
Well, I think that's a good point. I think there's a number of reasons that psychoanalysis, which was kind of in its heyday, probably in the 60s when it was the dominant form of treatment, and psychoanalysts were highly respected. And I mean, this was complicated because it really wasn't until the development of antipsychotic medications and then antidepressants that psychiatry was considered a respected profession. That because psychiatrists really couldn't do anything, right, without the kind of medicines that we have now, especially for people with severe mental disorders. There was no treatment, right?
Yeah.
So psychiatry became a much more respectable and probably better paid profession once antipsychotics were developed and then antidepressants. So psychoanalysis didn't have a lot of competition for other forms of treatment, and then for some people, like in the Woody Allen kind of parody or version of psychoanalysis, that there are certain people that was just normal. Everybody went to psychoanalysis. So I have had patients from Argentina who said everybody in Argentina is in psychoanalysis from when they're children.
Yeah.
Right. So, but that's not, especially on the West Coast, that's not a big part of our culture at all.
No.
And I think along with the development of antidepressants and other kinds of, also insurance companies didn't want to pay for psychoanalysis anymore, and cultural changes of the 60s and 70s attitudes about sexuality drastically changed. So I think it's not being relevant.
Right. So how does psychoanalysis catch up? Like Stephen Mitchell, calls refers to it as the beast. And in some ways, I'm sort of hearing that now as like, this is the beast. In Freud's understanding, this is the beast that needs taming inside of every person. And maybe in Mitchell's also saying, this is also the beast in our theory that we've got to figure out how to tame so that we can
Well, I
be
think
useful
that
again.
theory Mitchell's great gift was to read everything instead of what often happens is people who identify with a certain theory then become siloed in that theory and don't read anything else. He read everything and thought he put together things that he thought were useful from lots of different theoretical orientations. And so one thing that replaced drive theory was a look at how we develop, how we develop in the context of our family. So when it comes to sex and gender, what do we get taught about sexuality in our family? If you grew up in a religious family, what kind of messages did you get about sex? I actually remember my family hosted this. We sometimes hosted like exchange students or things like that, but this was a teenage girl from I grew up in Chicago, from Minnesota, who was like, everything was mysterious about her. And I found out years later that she was pregnant and that she got sense if we were staying with her, that she was going to go to some home for unwed mothers that that had to be far away from home. So, there's some cover story for why she wasn't in Minnesota.
Yeah.
That if you grew up in a family where that made a big impression on me, like, oh my God, if you get pregnant, they're going to send you away somewhere.
Right.
Which, that still happened. I don't know, maybe it still happens for that matter.
I think it does.
That, because there used to be, I think that the Wallingford, the Good Shepherd Center used to be a home for unwed girls.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
That's part of our history as well. So if you grow up in a family where there's a lot of shame about sex or a lot of prudishness, or if you grow up in a family where there's none of that and there's no boundaries and maybe there's sexual abuse,
Sure.
you're going to have, that's going to affect your development as a sexual being, your relationship to sexuality.
Yeah.
So relational theory was much more interested in thinking about what actually really happens to us, not some kind of id drive, but what do we experience growing up? How does that affect our relationship to our bodies, to our sense of ourselves as sexual beings? Is there trauma that's going to change things?
Sure.
How much is accepted in terms of experimenting or trying things out? Or certainly, as a clinician, that a huge number of people who seek us out for help are people who've experienced some kind of sexual trauma.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Right. So that changes how we develop as sexual beings. So anyway, Mitchell's point is that what really happened actually is what determines our relationship to our sexuality. And of course, I think it's also true that what's happening in the culture affects us. If you grew up in the late 60s and early 70s, there was both the free love, but there was also the feminist revolution and Stonewall and all those things that were really changing the social messages about sexuality.
Right. Yeah.
And now, of course, there's that relapse into trying to control everybody's sexuality with the fall of Roe. And Don't get me started.
A different podcast.
Yes.
So part of what I'm hearing you describe sounds to me like moving away from a way of thinking about sexuality that sort of had a preconceived, like, this is what's inside of every person and this is what it's supposed to be shaped into, and away from that and into a, like, well, who knows what's inside of a person to begin with, but their early experiences growing up heavily impact and maybe even fully define how they engage with and experience their own sexuality internally. It was this shift from, like, well, there's a default thing that's in there, to, like, who knows what you get started with, but whatever you end up with is probably determined by a combination of the culture you grew up in and in the subculture you grew up in of your family, and then also just your experiences of sexuality and of your own sexual self.
Well, and I think also bringing back the body into the question, not just of attachment and developmental experiences, but our relationships to our bodies, of how do we relate to our bodies, of what's it like to be in my particular body, and is it okay for me to touch myself in certain pleasurable ways, or did I get the message that I'll go blind if I do that, or whatever the message is about that. I don't think there's any denying that there is some kind of fundamental urge that almost everybody has. You remember being a teenager, probably.
Oh, sure.
That how you respond to that in yourself, your bodily inclinations, then I think interfaces with messages from your family, whether you've had trauma, what your personal experience is. And people use sex for all different kinds of reasons. Sex can be deployed for all kinds of psychological needs. Of, if kind of classic example is of if a girl has experienced, not having friends or being unpopular, all of a sudden she discovers that boys are really interested in her sexually, that she can get into trouble by deploying her sexuality as a way to get positive recognition without understanding what could be the negative outcome of that. But we deploy sex in all kinds of, that's not news that, stories of having to sleep with the boss to get a promotion, or I don't know, you could probably think of plenty of examples.
Yes. I work with adolescents. I hear lots of stories about ways that sex is deployed. Yeah. And it sounds like part of what there's kind of like an expanding, an sort of expansiveness, or a broadening of what sex could be for and could mean. That, like, the Freudian concept of these, like, instinct, aim, object categories are kind of like this is a very silly analogy, but play a lot of tabletop role-playing games where you roll dice and they tell you what to do. And sometimes dice explode, where if you roll a certain number, like a 6, then you get to roll even more dice, and the number goes up and up and up and up. And so that's a mechanic that some people use when they're designing their games. I'm so sorry, listener. This is a very nerdy tangent. But the image I got in my head is that, like, this shift of, like, thinking about sexuality a little bit differently kind of explodes it a little bit. All of a sudden, the permutations of what sex can mean for a person is far more broad. And it sounds like there is less of a implicit judgment on it and more of a, like, complex curiosity about it. Like, okay, you used sex in this moment for this thing, and that isn't therefore perverse or isn't therefore a problem that needs fixing. It might be, but even a moment ago when you said, like, you were talking about the inherent, like, the instinct, and if that's in people, and you said the word almost. You said almost everybody. And that in and of itself feels like a pretty significant thing to say, because to acknowledge even that, yeah, there are some people who they're asexual people exist. Even acknowledging that kind of radically challenges some of the, like, foundations of psychoanalysis. So to have a theory that makes room for that it feels important, but also challenging.
Yeah, and to try, and then again, because we have so many identity categories now, because there's an identity category for people who are asexual, that I think the categories, again, get us into trouble
Sure.
with this is who I am, not what I do, and understanding how are people using or not using their bodies and their sexuality, and why. This is, I think, what I hope happens in therapy, that each individual gets to have a personal connection with and understanding of how they use their own sexuality, how they experience it, what feels good, what doesn't feel good, what they want, what they don't want. That I think the Freud system seemed like it had a lot of rules to it.
Sure.
But I think that was I may be giving him too much credit, but I think that was also his trying to acquiesce to Victorian society by not being too radical, because he was giving lectures,
Right.
public lectures, and talking about polymorphus perversity, which is shocking in
Right.
the 1890s or 1900s. So I think it's important for relational psychoanalysis to get away from pathologizing and being the arbiter of what's normative
Right.
when it comes to sexuality and what's pathological, because that, it's not that long ago that the DSM had pathologizing diagnoses for certain kinds of sexuality.
Right. Listener, to define some terms a little bit, but to pathologize something is to talk about a thing as if it's inherently a problem. A pathology is a sickness, an illness. To pathologize something is to talk about something as if it's an illness. So an example that's likely coming to many of our listeners' minds is like homosexuality being considered a mental disorder. The DSM is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. We're on the 5th one. They're working on the 6th edition now. And it's the sort of shared document that the medical system in the US and a few other countries, although there's some international alternatives, that we all use to communicate to one another. We have these codes and we have these diagnoses. And so then if you have a client chart that client then moves to Florida, their doctor in Florida can read it and can understand, oh, this person was given this code. That means they have arthritis or whatever. And the DSM specifically is for the mental health related disorders, but it's part of that broader system. And the thing that I tell my clients is that it's mostly useful for communicating with insurance companies, but
I think that's its main function.
yeah, I think so too.
I have no other use for it.
Maybe it didn't used to be. Maybe there used to be other functions for it, but it doesn't seem like that's likely. And up until, what was it, the DSM-3, where there was the big controversy? There was a really great Radio Lab episode about this. Listener, I'll link to it in the show notes. But it was kind of a big deal when homosexuality was removed from the DSM, because it had been in there a long time and it was staying in there a long time.
I think that was in the American Psychological Association decriminalized or depathologized. Took it out in, I think it was 1971.
Wow.
It was the early 1970s.
Yeah.
But there's still the American Psychoanalytic Association didn't start admitting candidates to train in analysis until the early 1990s, and that was under the threat of a lawsuit.
Wow.
So there still was a lot of years, at least in psychoanalysis, where homosexuality was considered a developmental problem that you needed to go back to analysis to undo, and then once you were cured of your homosexuality, then you could get into analytic training.
Which is something that sounds pretty absurd to to me.
Well, there were a couple of famous people like Ralph Roughton and Richard Isay, who some people will recognize those names, who were not practicing their gayness when they got in, but then started practicing after they were already in, which is how they got in, and were very influential within psychoanalysis of speaking out about that and making a difference.
Yeah.
So
there's a couple directions that I kind of want this conversation to go, but I'm guessing we have to pick one. But I'm hearing this sort of development within the theory from a kind of pathologizing of what's not normative. And by normative, listener, that it doesn't mean it's kind of like normal, but not quite. Normative is when you say this is the way it ought to be. So psychoanalysis had this like normative idea of sexuality. This is how sexuality ought to be. And in the past 20, 30 years, there was a movement away from that, away from saying this is how sexuality ought to be, into something a little bit more descriptive, maybe? And curious. This is how sexuality seems to be working in people, and a kind of openness to more kinds of difference that don't indicate pathology or wellness one way or the other. It's just kind of a fact of being a person.
yeah, well said. I think that the idea that I'm not wild about the expression your authentic self, because I don't know what the word authentic means really, but there was so much suffering that was clearly caused by people who were having to be in the closet and whose lives were significantly impacted by homophobia. That I think that recognition that creating these normative standards and saying it's not okay to be you were really, really destructive. So that I think we have shifted to, well, first of all, I think homosexuality within psychoanalysis is like a non-event now, right? That's completely accepted. And I think that the ideas of gender dysphoria and how gender develops has dramatically changed as culture has demanded that it change as well. But yeah, to be psychoanalysis, psychology in general has had a normativizing function to say,
Sure,
this is what normal people are, and if you aren't that, you're deviant.
right.
So to take that responsibility seriously and to say that needs to not be our job.
Right.
Because we're seeing now this reversal where there are, people in the extreme religious right who want to reimpose all those kinds of normativizing restrictions on who people can be.
Yeah. And I've also I work with a lot of trans people, right? That's a lot of the folks who I see. And I'm very aware of the controversy within the trans community around the category of gender dysphoria, because it's inherently pathologizing, and it's a diagnosis that you need to have on your chart to receive this particular medical care. So I give people that diagnosis in part so that they can get treatments that will, in the same way that antidepressants can save people's lives, hormones save people's lives, and I've seen it happen. But for them to do that, I need to give them this diagnosis, which is inherently pathologizing. But then there's also this, sorry, I'm sort of thinking out loud. There's this tension that I'm hearing when talking about sexuality, and maybe it applies to a certain degree to gender as well, where these categories can be really limiting when we want to think about a person and how a person works. And these identity categories are really important for us to create community and have community and find community. They seem to be really important on a societal level to be able to say, like, these are my people. And those identity categories can sometimes limit people's ability to engage with all of the different parts of themselves.
Yeah, it's making me think about Judith Butler's work, in particular her idea of what do you have to be a recognizable subject to society, right? To be able to, so you're talking about community, but there's also a way that I need to have my subjectivity validated and recognized in the way that I'm expressing it or living it.
Yeah.
And so there are forces, political forces now that want to say that's not a viable subjectivity.
Right. And the conversation around it even is to say that to be trans is to be mentally ill, right? That's the argument. And from my experience in psychoanalytic spaces, there are some people who I've tried to talk to about some of my trans clients, and it's impossible to have a conversation that doesn't talk about psychosis. Because the fact that I'm talking about someone whose gender identity is different than the one that they were assigned at birth, their mind, this person who I have had conversations with, their mind immediately goes to psychosis. Because in their brain, well, the gender you're born with is your gender. And if you think you're a different one, then you're psychotic. That's just the theory that they're working with.
I can't imagine that there isn't anybody who hasn't had some feeling of an out of gender experience of at some time in their life. I think men have a version of it, or I mean, just think about my own. I was thinking about this. There's these really fun pictures from when I'm 5. I'm with my best friend Larry Crawford, and he's got these really cool Hawaiian print swimming trunks on. I have these kind of goofy shorts, and neither of us have any top on. And we're like in the swimming pool having a great time. And I really remember when my mother said, "You can't not wear a shirt anymore." I'm like, why? Because I look exactly like Larry Crawford from the top up. Feeling like, well, that's just insane. Like, I didn't mind being a girl, but I minded that the roles were different for girls. And that happened a lot because I was a kid before Title IX. So there were a lot of, I was like the best pitcher in the baseball team. They let me pitch for Little League, but I couldn't play in the games because I was a girl. I'm like, why? So, I mean, my own experience was, I don't want to be a boy, but I don't want this definition of what being a girl is like, right? So that, and conversely, I had the experience of walking into a coffee shop, and I was dressed like I am today, having like a nice dressy blouse and some white pants. I happened to have on Doc Martens, and this woman who's got on this really tight-fitting top with lots of cleavage sticking out and a very short, tight skirt and high heels. And she walked in the door in front of me, and I thought, are we from the same species, the same group, right? Not so much that I felt like I was failing at my gender performance as a female, but I just looked at her and I thought, she is as alien to me. Dressing up like that is so alien to my experience that I can't imagine that. But I've also had patients who've literally said, male patients who've said, "You're not very feminine, are you?" To be able to, I mean, they weren't the most tactful patients, I guess, but who in essence were saying, "You're not doing a very good job of performing your gender correctly." Yeah. But, I think probably men have that when, if they are moved to tears at some moment when they're not supposed to cry, or I don't know, you would have maybe a better idea of.
Well, I'm remembering I was on a mission trip. There was a time in my life where that was going to be a big part of my life, and that's no longer the case. But I was on a
So
mission
this was
trip.
not a mission to another planet.
No, it was a mission. Well, it might as well have been. Oh, Southeast Asia. Oh, boy. But we were on this mission trip, and we were kayaking for some reason. I don't know what that had to do with our
Kayaking
mission.
for the Lord.
Yes, kayaking for Jesus. I think he enjoyed our kayaking trip, likely. And I was in this. There were these two people kayaked, and I was paired up with one of the leaders of the group, and we were paddling along, and I was just about to go off to Seattle to go to school, and she was talking to me about like, well, what church are you going to go to, and like, what are you going to do, and somehow our conversation moved to like where I felt like I fit in the group and in like the social circles that I run in. Because this group was mostly women, and there was me and one other guy on this trip. And I said, just sort of thinking out loud to her as this 18-year-old, I was like, I don't know. I think there's a lot of ways where I'm just like more feminine. And she said, she reacted like she was offended. She was like, no, not feminine. Sensitive maybe, but you're still a man. And I remember that phrase, sensitive maybe, but you're still a man. And it was like, for me to say, I don't know, I feel kind of feminine, was like a threat to something.
Yes, it was emasculating.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Which is not how I experience. She actually recommended I go to Mars Hill, the church.
Oh, we know what happened to that place.
Yeah, toxic masculinity is what happened to that place on an epic scale. So I'm glad I didn't listen to her. That's not true. I went to Mars Hill a couple times, and then I did what most college students did, and I stopped going to church because there are more fun things to do on my Sunday mornings, like sleep.
So you really were on a mission to Mars.
I was. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That's funny. But I think part of what I'm curious about is when talking about gender, like, did psychoanalysis have a similar kind of development along as we talked about with sexuality, where there was this kind of normative, prescriptive, this is how it ought to be, and then more recently a movement towards a more open, like gender is a part of a person's mind but isn't predetermined to be one thing or another?
Yeah, I think psychoanalysis was dominated by men forever, male voices.
Yeah.
And even women analysts had to kind of act like men to be in the club. But, the beginning of relational psychoanalysis was brought in voices from all different disciplines of, like, Jessica Benjamin,
Right.
who comes from critical theory and social theory, Adrian Harris, who comes from developmental theory, Merrill Dimmon, who came from anthropology. Mm-hmm. And these all have this really strong feminist background. So,
yeah.
And Steve Mitchell was really open to wanted them included from the very beginning in the there were these small groups to get together to talk that sort of invented this new way of thinking.
Yeah.
And feminism was a huge part of that. So I think the kind of questioning of the underlying assumptions that were never questioned about gender by psychoanalysis, we're suddenly now saying, society has a huge impact on how we all develop in terms of our genderedness. That's making me think of what you said before about gender dysphoria. Virginia Goldner wrote a wonderful article about trans things where she pointed out that if a woman, like Kim Kardashian, for example, wants to go have, butt implants and breasts modified and all kinds of plastic surgery, she doesn't have to go have a psychiatric evaluation first, right? So it's okay to go from being femme to more femme.
Right.
But if you want to cross, then you have to get permission in a psychiatric interview that it's a weird paradox, right? That because of course some people use plastic surgery to make themselves look like they're from another planet. Right?
Well, I'm thinking about the idea of like thinking about sexuality in terms of like how we use it and like what it's used for, and how like I think gender is often something that we use.
Yes,
we use it for
absolutely.
lots of different things. I've known people who used their gender to protect themselves, and I've known people who used their gender to be provocative and challenging. And people who've used their gender to move up in their careers, and people who have minimized their gender so that they could move up in their careers.
Yeah, that reminds me of this wonderful, remarkable patient I saw years ago who had come from a really abusive childhood and escaped home, but lived on the streets and passed as a boy for, I don't know, like a decade, because she figured out
It'd be safer.
that was a way to avoid. So there's some obvious things like that. But in my work with trans people, I feel like I'm a little reluctant about the places that are just 100%. If you think that you're trans, we'll do everything we can to facilitate your next steps. And I won't do those evaluations because I'm so opposed to the whole idea of them. That I think that's wrong to have to give people a psychiatric disorder.
Right.
But people need it, so good that you're willing to do it.
Right.
But it has been my experience that people use their gender for lots of complicated reasons and sometimes have had the experience that somebody who did work with somebody who was facilitated a very easy, smooth, oh, so you're trans, here, I'll help you do this, without really asking very many questions, that in working more closely with this person, it really seemed like they needed a new way to start. That their sense of themselves as a person, as a subject, had just felt like it was failing. And so it was either kind of suicide or then the idea that, oh, I could transition and have a new start, and had like a whole fantasy, a whole imagination about this person that they could become.
Yeah.
That was fixing a different problem, right?
Yeah.
And what we discovered was, they went through the transition process, but they still had the thing that they had before, right? Like, how do I have, because they still didn't really have a viable sense of being somebody that to themselves, they could be in the world, not just to other people.
Yeah.
So sometimes people are too quick to facilitate, like, oh, this will fix the problem, without really looking more deeply at what does the person need that they're using gender to try to achieve. Not that there's anything wrong with transitioning, but maybe it's missing the point of what a person actually really needs. Who's trying to figure out how to have a viable sense of being a subject to themselves.
Yeah, I feel like there's a parallel here with, I made the comment before, in the same way that that antidepressants can save lives, I've seen hormones be able to save lives. And like similarly to how antidepressants are really effective at like reducing the symptoms, but don't always, they don't get to the underlying cause. Sometimes the underlying cause of depression appears to be purely like biological imbalance of chemicals in the brain, and like, okay. And I've met people who they take their meds and then things are better and they're just like, I'm good. I'm good. That's their experience, and I'm not going to take that away from them. And I've also met an awful lot more people who take their meds, and that helps a lot. And there's also something that depression was coming from. There's something that spurned the symptom that there's some benefit in being curious about and trying to make sense of or engage with or make contact with lots of different words for some version of like, look at it and think about it. And I'm hearing you suggest that maybe there's something similar going on with gender. We're like, yeah, transition is a powerful, important, significant part of a trans person's experience. And that if we think of gender as this thing that just is in a person one way or another, then we might miss out on a lot of the ways that we use gender and the ways that gender evolves and develops in a person.
Right, exactly.
That the curiosity isn't so that we can gatekeep better, but so that we can help people understand themselves better and more fully.
Right, and in some ways, trans can reify the gender binary, so that non-binary is this whole other thing that, I mean, in some ways it's kind of exciting because it seems like it's trying to undo, going to be hard to get rid of, because in part, then we have to choose from the gendered performances to create a non-binary thing. So it's like we're stuck in this circular thing of how do you get outside of the gender binary. But I think there's I remember working with this man he was really, really handsome. He dressed impeccably. He was financially successful. He had a lot of money. And he had a tremendous amount of guilt. I mean, he was also white. For his white male privilege and everything he had in life. And so he tended to date women of color who didn't have very much money and helped him out financially. And he was seriously thinking about trying to figure out how to be non-binary as a way, I think, to try to solve his problem with feeling guilty for all of his male white privilege, a way to try to say, I want to find the community of, like you were saying before about how important community is, a community of, I don't want to belong to this club that I kind of fell into, but I don't like being in this club. And I thought that was really interesting that he was seriously thinking about trying to perform his gender differently, as both to escape something in himself, but also to identify differently with other folks.
That is fascinating. I think there in the outline that we're working off of, you included a Judith Butler quote that like I hadn't seen before, and I want to read it because it's coming to mind now. So thank you for giving this. But the idea that gender is an imitation for which there is no original.
Right, exactly.
That concept is like, whew. I'm sure there are some listeners who are like, yeah, Tyson, that's like basic feminism. I'm sorry. I went to an evangelical undergrad. I wasn't exposed to a lot of basic feminism.
Not everybody's read Judith Butler.
Yeah, including me. So, but now you've heard that quote, and I think I'm aware of time, and I want to respect your time and wrap us up. And again, to sort of oversimplify a lot of what we talked about, the thing that I'm hearing you say is, in answer to the question, what's a psychoanalytic understanding of sex and gender? Part of the answer is it's complex and it's curious about what people are up to in their use of and engagement with their sexuality and gender, both as they are things that are done and as they are things that we are, both in terms of identity and action. And it sounds like if there's an invitation in what you're describing, it's an invitation to use psychoanalysis or an analytic psychotherapy or whatever, that space, as a space to be able to be curious about the ways that you don't fit into the categories. There are some ways that in general conversation, we've all accepted certain categories, and we all share them and we don't question them. And I present myself as a cis man in the world. And as we've already talked about, I've had experiences that are outside of my gender. And a psychotherapy or a psychoanalysis is a space to be curious about those other parts, to be able to say, hey, there are parts of me that don't fit the categories that I adhere to kind of rigidly outside of here. to be a little less rigid about it, to be a little more curious about it, and maybe discover new parts of oneself, and maybe understand oneself a little bit more, maybe find some conflicts that can be resolved or something. I don't know.
Or just to have a better sense of kind of claiming, a sense of owning who you are and how you want to perform or express yourself. That in addition to all the developmental things we talked about, there's also Francisco Gonzalez and others have introduced the idea of the social unconscious. So not just Freud's unconscious, but the way that we are interfacing all the time with not just psychological norms, but with pressure from society, from how to be or how to look or how to act. And I think that analysis can be enormously helpful in trying to help a person find what, how they're put together, what matters to them, what it would mean to them to live passionately, and with as much self-awareness as possible, as opposed to just following trends or trying to either avoid or get some benefit. That I think those of us who do this work believe and have a passion for self-awareness as a path to fulfillment in life. So,
Absolutely.
That's the commercial for
Yeah.
psychoanalysis.
All right. Well, I'm sold. Anything that you would like to plug or advertise? If people are hearing this conversation and they want to find you, where would you like to be found?
Well, I do have a website, so I could be found on the interweb.
Yes.
What do I want to plug? Read Judith Butler, read Michel Foucault, study history, because history is repeating itself right now. And Milan Kundera said, man's struggle with power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. So I might have gotten that not exactly right, but this seems really important right now. To be able to remember where we've been, and to not forget what we know from the past.
That does feel really important and relevant to the things that we're discussing today, because they often come for queer people first, the controlling, normatizing systems. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
It was fun.
I'm glad. Special thanks to Sally Bjorklund for coming on to this episode of the podcast. Sally can be found at her website, sallybjorklund.com. Sally has also provided us with quite the extensive further learning list of resources. The book list that Sally provided could serve as the reading list for a course, an introductory course on a psychoanalytic understanding of sex and gender. So listener, if anything that we talked about today really caught your attention or sparked your curiosity, I highly encourage you to check out that book list in the further learning section. There's a lot of ways into this topic, and a lot of those books are a lovely starting point. For an experiment this episode, we really just have a couple of questions that we'd love you to ponder, listener. The first question is, when were you first aware of your gender? And the follow-up question to that, when have you felt like you weren't doing your gender right, or misaligned with your gender, misattuned with it? My hope is that these two questions might get you thinking about your own gender identity development in ways that maybe you haven't thought about before, and also about how you use your gender in the way that Sally and I talked about in this episode. And some of the same questions can be applied to sexuality as well. How do you use your sexuality? When did you first become aware of your sexuality? When did you feel misaligned with your sexuality? So yeah, that's the experiment. Just think about it, see what comes up. And if you're in therapy and are interested, talk to your therapist about it. Because if your therapist is anything like me, they will be very curious to hear. The Relational Psych podcast is a production of Relational Psych, a mental health clinic providing depth-oriented psychotherapy and psychological testing in person in Seattle and virtually throughout Washington state. If you are interested in psychotherapy or psychological testing for yourself or a family member, links to our contact information are in the show notes. If you are a psychotherapist and would like to be a guest on the show, or are a listener with a suggestion for someone you'd like us to interview, you can contact me at podcast@relationalpsych.group. The Relational Psych podcast is hosted and produced by me, Tyson Connor. Sam Claney is our executive producer with technical support by Ali Ray and the team at Virtual Ally. Carly Claney is our CEO. Our music is by Ben Lewis. We love you, buddy.